Well, hey, hello, how are you? How's it going? How's your year so far? Happy February. I can't believe we are a month into 2022 already. How's your year going so far? I really hope it's awesome and wonderful because the last few years have been anything but, so I really hope that your year is off to a wonderful start. My name is Krystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases, so that's what I talk about. If you like true crime and you want to feel better about your own makeup skills, well, like, subscribe, and come hang out with me every Tuesday where I talk about a true crime case while, you know, slapping on my war paint. I can't believe I've already put up a month's worth of videos on YouTube. I know that's, you know, peanuts. That's not really like anything, but for me, it's a big deal. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, and thank you so much to anyone and everyone who has liked, subscribed, watched, commented. Thank you so much. I know it's mainly like friends and family and friends of family, etc., but I truly appreciate it. And hey, we all have to start somewhere, right? So thank you so much. Like I said, I'm having so much fun doing these, and not only am I, you know, furthering skills that I've already been interested in, you know, like camera work and editing, but like I'm discovering other things that I'm really getting into, like set design. As you can see, I've updated the set just a little bit. Now, it is a work in progress. I do have to fix the panels here and whatnot and, you know, do some adjustments. But, you know, I was just kind of playing with it and wanted to see what it looked like. So I hope you like it too. And like I said, it's a work in progress, so just bear with me. Another thing that I have started doing when I'm doing my editing and in post is, you know, of course, critiquing with each video I do. I want to get better and better with each one, you know. So one thing I have been trying to critique myself on is my hosting abilities. And there are a couple things that I noticed that I was doing that I will go ahead and stop doing. I will try very hard to. One thing I noticed was that I do a lot of like, you know, stuff like that, you know. I don't know what you want from me. I was born and mostly raised in Southern California, and I just did it right there. So I'm gonna try very hard to limit the, you know, the smacking, whatever you want to call that. So I will try to stop that. Thank you for being patient with me. Secondly, you know, I didn't really notice, see, I just did it again. I didn't really notice that when I was tapping my brushes, you know, with, you know, tapping that excess product off, I was doing it right in front of my microphone and it was catching on the audio, so I will be more wary of that, so sorry. Like I said, it's a work in progress and I try very hard to improve with each video, so yeah. I think that's enough like blabbering. Let's go ahead and get into today's case, shall we? So today's case is an unsolved case from the 1970s, and I wanted to cover it because when I first heard about it, you know, I kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit, and I just became really drawn to this case, to the victims. I said this last week in the Bianca Devins video. All murder is tragic and just awful, but when it happens to really young victims, it makes it that much more tragic. And today's victims are only 19 and 20 years old. And yeah, so I wanted to talk about it. And now, it like I said, it's a cold case. It's an unsolved case from the 1970s. It is known as the Valentine's Day Murders. And yeah, I usually give a disclaimer before I get into the case, but I think you're good. For today, there's nothing really too graphic or anything like that, so you should be good. And let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? Let's get into the murders of Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann, otherwise known as the Valentine's Day Murders. So, who are Patricia and Jesse? Well, Patricia. Patricia was Patricia Ann Mann, and she was born February 6th, 1951 in Sanford, North Carolina. Her parents were William Fletcher Mann and Layla Signer Mann, and unfortunately, when Patricia was very, very young, like I think still like a baby or a toddler, William, her father, unfortunately did pass away, so she was raised primarily by her mother. But you know, even though that tragedy befell her and she didn't have her father growing up, Patricia did not lack for family. Her family lived very, very close by. The Manns all lived within like a 1-block radius of each other. And so, yeah, Patricia was not lacking for family at all. She was raised by her mother and her family, which, you know, that must have been nice. That must have been nice for her mother, too. I can't imagine having a young baby and then having, you know, your partner, your spouse, you know, pass away like that. So, good for Patricia. Now, Patricia was a petite young thing, you know, she was only like 5'1", she was blonde-haired, blue eyes, and she looked like your, you know, stereotypical girl next door. And she was just described as, you know, just being, you know, very cute and funny and caring, and like I said, her family grew up within like a 1-block radius around her, and so she grew up next to her cousin, Carolyn Signer. She's now known as Carolyn Spivey, but back then she was Carolyn Signer, and Patricia and Carolyn grew up next door to each other, and even though they were cousins, because they, you know, grew up next door to each other and came from a small, tight-knit community and a close family, the two were more like sisters. They were never without one another. They were often mistaken for actual blood sisters. They looked very much alike, and yeah, they were just total BFFs. Now, all growing up, they had like their life goals, what they wanted to do with their lives. Carolyn wanted to be a nurse, and Patricia wanted to be a teacher. And so that was the plan, that Carolyn was going to grow up to be a nurse, and Patricia was going to grow up to be a teacher. She really loved helping people. However, by the time she reached high school, Patricia realized that she actually had a passion for nursing and for the medical field, and so she decided that after graduation, she was also going to apply to be a nurse alongside her cousin Carolyn. So that was the plan after high school, and now the plan was for the two girls to go be nurses. They specifically wanted to attend Watts Hospital Training School for Nurses, and this was located in Durham, North Carolina. Now, Watts was a very prestigious institution. It was known for churning out top quality nursing talent. It had a very prestigious reputation, and rightfully so. So if you were accepted to Watts as a nursing student, you would live on the campus dormitories all year round. They had a rigorous 3-year training program, and this program was intense. I mean, there was a reason it had the reputation it did. There was a reason why it churned out such top quality nursing talent. So yeah, it was this 3-year rigorous training program. So on top of living on the campus all year round, you also had your nursing classes like, you know, you would do at nursing school. So you had your classes and your homework and that kind of stuff. But on top of that, you also had clinical duties to do at the hospital. Like, they got actual practical hands-on training, which just sounds amazing. They would do clinical duties at the hospital, and they would rotate in different wards and like different departments of the hospital, working with different doctors and just dealing with different types of cases. And like I said, I mean, there's a reason it had the reputation that it did. That just sounds amazing. Like, I wish most higher education training, like, I wish it came with more practical hands-on experience like that, you know? Like, I don't know about you, but I know when I went to film school, I feel like I wrote more papers than actually filmed stuff. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I just think this idea of getting practical hands-on experience is just amazing. And it obviously worked for them because, like I said, they were known for churning out the best nurses in the country. And as such, it was hard to get in, as you can imagine, right? So Carolyn and Patricia, they apply to Watts, and this is where their plans hit their first snag. Carolyn was not accepted to Watts. However, Patricia was. And so Patricia found herself in Durham, a much bigger city than what she was used to, at this prestigious school doing this rigorous training program. And she was all on her own for like the first time in her life, you know, which, you know, for a lot of kids, that's kind of their first foray into the world without their parents or anyone, right? It's usually college or school or something. But for Patricia, you know, it's harder for some kids than other kids, you know. I think it definitely depends on your background. And Patricia, you know, she came from a very close-knit background, you know, surrounded by her family in a very small community where everyone knew everyone. And now here she is at this big school in this bigger city, not really knowing anyone, doing this intense training program. Like, it was a lot, and it is said that her freshman year, her first year at Watts, was really, really tough on her. Like, really tough. She almost didn't make it. She actually wanted to drop out. She wanted to drop out of Watts, but Carolyn, being the ride-or-die chick that she is, talked her out of it and was like, oh, no, you don't. You worked hard to get into there, and it is a great school. You're great at nursing. Like, you stick with it. And Patricia did. And like I said, it was hard that first year. Like, so not only is she away from her family for the first time in her life, she was also balancing a long distance relationship with her boyfriend of quite some time. And, you know, on top of everything else, she had this long distance relationship to contend with. So it was very rough her first year, but she made it. She made it through. And in her junior year at Watts, her boyfriend, who she had maintained a long distance relationship with, actually gave her a pre-engagement ring because they were discussing the next steps in their relationship, and he gave her a pre-engagement ring. I'm not quite sure what a pre-engagement ring is. I'm going to guess it's something maybe like a promise ring. But yeah, that's where her relationship was at. And yeah, she was in her junior year at Watts, just doing really well. So, who was Patricia's boyfriend that she was getting serious with? Well, it was none other than Jesse Allen McBain. Now, Jesse, he was born almost a year to the day later than Patricia. He was born February 15th, 1952. So Patricia was born February 6th, and he was February 15th. I just thought that was a sweet little, like, coincidence that their birthdays were so close to one another. And he was born to Alan Newland and Hilda Mae McBain of the Eli Whitney community of Pittsboro, North Carolina, another small town community. Jesse had a couple of siblings. He had a sister named Gail and a brother named Marty. And you know how I described Patricia as sort of like looking like that quintessential girl next door? Well, Jesse was sort of the male equivalent of that. He was 5'10", brown hair, brown eyes, very athletic. He was on the football team. He was very, very into sports, very athletic. And he was also, you know, quite popular and just really well liked. He was voted most... I just threw my makeup brush. Anyway... So Jesse was voted most likely to succeed at his high school. And yeah, he was just really well loved. He had a positive reputation. Friends and family said that even though he looked really intimidating, you know, because he was like 5'10" and really muscular and athletic, so like he could like look intimidating. He never like used that to intimidate or bully anyone. That just wasn't his style. He was more laid back and carefree. He was known to like a prank every now and then, and his favorite thing to do on the weekends, besides take Patricia out, was just to hang out with his buddies in the cornfield drinking beer, you know? He was just that quintessential small town guy. Now, the Mann and the McBain families apparently did know each other, so they were friends. And in fact, when Patricia first started dating Jesse, Jesse introduced Caroline to his best friend, a gentleman by the name of David Spivey. Yeah, and Carolyn is known as Carolyn Spivey today, so the two ended up getting married and they are still together. So, I thought that was kind of sweet. Now, like I said, Patricia and Jesse's relationship was sort of approaching that next stage where you start discussing, what your next steps in life are going to be, And so they had been dating for about 3 or 4 years. Again, most of it was long distance. So Patricia and Jesse were very used to not seeing each other during the week. And when they did see each other, it was mainly on the weekends when Jesse had access to his car. And they would go on dates then. And in the meantime, during the week, they just wrote each other a lot of letters. Now, back in those days, and especially in that area, apparently long-distance phone calls were, very uncommon. They were almost unheard of. And so the primary, form of communication that you would have with someone over a great distance was, writing letters. And yeah, the two would usually talk about what they were going to do that weekend for their date night. Among the other usual stuff you would write your significant other about. And that was the primary way that Jesse and Patricia communicated with each other. Now, like I said, a majority of the relationship was long distance. And now remember, Patricia was a year older than Jesse. So when she went to her freshman year at Watts, Jesse was still finishing up his senior year at high school. And their long distance relationship, that distance increased once Jesse went to college. He went to North Carolina State University. And so they were separated, by an even greater distance. So, February 12th, 1971, all right, that's the date that we are at, and there's actually a Valentine's Day dance scheduled to be happening at the Watts campus. Now, Patricia and Jesse, they're not even slated to attend this dance, all right? It was not in either of their plans. You see, that day, Patricia and her fellow nurses, they were to take their state board exams that day. And now Patricia had a plan with a fellow nurse by the name of Sue Hartley. She goes by Sue Griffiths now. And she had a plan with this fellow nurse that they were going to take their exams together. And then Sue, who was on her way out of Durham, would drop Patricia off at Sanford so that she could have a date with Jesse that weekend. And so that was the original plan. However, that plan hit a snag when Sue, she finished her exams way before Patricia. So Patricia, she, took her nursing duties really, really seriously, all right? And she liked to be super, super careful when it came to taking exams. She liked to go over her tests several times. I can totally relate. Totally been there where you just want to go over it over and over and just make sure you didn't miss anything. And so that's kind of how Patricia was. So Sue finished her exams way before Patricia. And so apparently Patricia was like, you know what? Don't even worry about it. Go ahead, take off. I will find other plans. I will find another way to get to Sanford. So don't even worry about it. And so Sue left Durham without Patricia while Patricia finished up her state board exam. Now, eventually, it got to the point where it was just Patricia and one other girl who were still taking their exams. And suddenly, Patricia got called to the office because she had a surprise visitor. And who was this surprise visitor? Why, it was Jesse, of course. He had come to surprise Patricia. And he said, hey, guess what? I got the car unexpectedly for tonight. So guess what? We're going to go to the Valentine's Day dance at Watts. So yeah, when you're done, I'm going to pick you up and we're just going to have a really good time. So, awesome. And it said that when Patricia got back to the exam room, she was just all bubbly and excited. She was totally not expecting this surprise date. She wasn't expecting to go to the dance with Jesse, and she was just super excited at the idea. So yeah, like I said, Jesse wasn't even supposed to have the car that night. So this was Friday night. That was not Jesse's usual night to have the car. He shared the car with his brother Marty, and Marty's nights were on Fridays while Jesse's were on Saturdays. However, he had worked out a deal with Marty so that he could take the car that Friday and drive from his parents' house all the way down to Durham to pick up Patricia for the dance. And it is said that Jesse was just really looking forward to going to the dance with Patricia. He was super, super excited to unexpectedly, get the car and be able to go. And he was so excited that he actually left the box of Valentine's Day chocolates that he had bought for Patricia. He left them at home in his haste to get out the door. So yeah, I thought that was just kind of cute. He was that excited. Now, Jesse left the house in a burgundy t-shirt and a pair of plaid slacks. And when he picked up Patricia, she was wearing a pink and white checkered dress. And so the two left and attended the dance at the Watts campus. Now, the dance was attended by about 50 people. And at around 11:30 p.m., when the dance was still going on, Patricia and Jesse, they decided to leave, and they left the dance together. And Patricia ends up signing out of her dormitory. Yeah, so she signed out of her dormitory. So not only was the curriculum at Watts very strict and very difficult, the nursing students there were very closely monitored, all right? So every night they had what was called a close study from 7 to 9 p.m. And this was when the nurses were locked in their rooms, literally locked in their dorm rooms. And it was supposed to be the time where they were quiet and studied. Okay. Now, televisions weren't really ubiquitous around this time. And, even if they were, they wouldn't have been able to turn on the television. They couldn't even turn on the radio during this closed study time. It was supposed to be quiet time where you studied. And there was this sort of she was described as a house mother of sorts, and she would patrol the dormitories during closed study time, and to make sure, none of the girls were outside of their dorms. And if she did catch you outside of your dorms, even to go to the bathroom, you would get in trouble. You'd get written up, which, doesn't really sound advisable to, hold your, your innards like that for 2 hours, but, whatever. And then they said the nurses were locked in their dorms, so I don't know how a nurse would be patrolling the halls anyway, I guess, unless she, broke out or something. I don't know. That's just what they said. So it was pretty intense, and so the nurses were heavily, heavily monitored. And on top of that, get this, this was a trip. This was a trip when I read this. If your family lived in Durham, the city of Durham, where Watts was located, you had to get their permission to leave campus, and you could only leave campus on the weekends. But if your family lived in the area, you had to get their permission before you were allowed to leave campus. Yeah, can you imagine that? Now, if your family didn't live in the area, like Patricia's, you would sign out at the dormitory, sign out, where you were going, where you're going to be back, who you're going to be with, what you were going to do. Like I said, they kept a really close eye on these nurses, all right? And I was trying to think of, today, can you imagine a college, a university, telling you that you can't leave campus and you had to get your family's permission? I just thought that was really wild. But yeah, that's what Patricia did. She signed out of her dormitory that night around 11:30 when she left the dance with Jesse. And that would be the last time anyone would see Patricia and Jesse alive. Now, Patricia and Jesse, when they left the dance, they were headed towards what was known as sort of a lover's lane area among the students. And it was this neighborhood that was just being developed. It's a modern day neighborhood called Krystal today. But in 1971, during this time, it was not yet developed. They had just started laying the foundations for the neighborhood. They had a bunch of cul-de-sacs cut out in the dirt and made some dirt roads in the formation of cul-de-sacs. And that was about it. There was no development of housing yet, no paved roads, nothing like that. So this area served as sort of the local lover's lane area. Now, apparently there was an unspoken rule among the girls that if you came across an occupied cul-de-sac, you just moved on to the next available one. All right, you didn't pull in and like pulled up next to them, nothing like that. You moved on to the next available one. And apparently some of the girls had their own sort of like unofficial designated spot that would always be kept open in case they ever, wanted to use it to bring their boyfriends. I am unclear as to whether Patricia had her own like designated spot, if her and Jesse did. I was unclear about that. But yeah, that was the last place that Patricia and Jesse were headed. Now, by 1:10 a.m. that evening/morning, the house mother, she's on top of it, all right? She is patrolling the dorms to make sure all of the girls were back by curfew. Now, curfew was usually midnight, but since they had the Valentine's Day dance that night, the curfew had been pushed back to 1 a.m. So it's 1:10 a.m., and the house mother is doing her checks, making sure that all the girls are back. And she can't find Patricia anywhere, which, this is immediately alarming to her, because Patricia was known to not just take her nursing duty seriously, like she took rules very seriously. In my elementary school, she would have been known as like, a goody-goody, she had that kind of reputation where she wouldn't break the rules. She wanted to do a good job, and she just wasn't like the type. And Jesse had kind of like that equal reputation where, he wouldn't push Patricia to do something she was uncomfortable with. He would never push her to break the rules. Like, he also had the stellar reputation. So immediately, something is feeling off. So the house mother enlists the help of the other nursing students, and they conduct a search of the whole campus, going dormitory by dormitory, inch by inch across the whole campus, looking for Patricia. And they don't find any sign of her, all right? They can't find any sign of her. And now, like I said, because of Patricia's reputation and the fact that she had never been in trouble, alarm bells are immediately sounding off. Now, because the nurses were so closely monitored at Watts, they, developed a close camaraderie with each other. And so they got to know each other a little bit, which, you would, being in a situation like that, we're closely monitored and whatnot. Your fellow nurses are going to be able to relate to you what's going on, right? So, yeah, nurses are worried, the house mother's worried, so they attempt to call the Durham Police Department. And the police department, of course, tells them there's nothing they can do, like, you gotta wait 24 hours, I'm sorry, but 10 minutes after curfew just isn't gonna cut it. And so they were dismissed. And so, yeah, I'm sure the nurses had a very restless night that night. So by the next morning, Patricia still was nowhere to be found. They tried to look again. She had never signed back into her dormitory. They conducted another search of the campus, and again, couldn't find anything. And so, again, her fellow nurses were like, you know what? We don't care. We're going to head down to the police department again to try to file her as a missing person, because this isn't right. This isn't Patricia. The nurses had also, before going to the police station, they had also attempted to call the local hospitals around the areas and the surrounding counties to make sure that Patricia and Jesse hadn't gotten into an accident, and they still didn't find anything. So that's when they finally decided to go to the Durham County Police Department, and once again, they were dismissed. It just hadn't been long enough, and it is said that the desk sergeant was especially dismissive and rude to the girls, like crudely dismissing Patricia and Jesse's disappearance as like, oh yeah, they're probably off screwing or something. Which, by the way, is just very unprofessional. Like, I get you're in law enforcement, so like you see this like all the time, right? And like most of the time, they end up coming back. But, the people you're dealing with aren't used to dealing with that on a day-by-day basis. And I don't know, I just think you should show a little bit more tact, because usually when people are coming to the police to report a loved one missing, they're scared, they don't know what to do. So yeah, I read that, and I don't know, it just really bothered me that he was just like crudely dismissive, like, oh yeah, she's probably off getting screwed or something. Like, just so gross, just so, so not warranted. But even though they were dismissed by the police, her fellow nursing students, they were like, you know what? screw it, we will look for her ourselves. If the police aren't going to do anything, we will go ahead and do it. And so they decided to go look for Patricia and Jesse on their own. And so they talked, you know, amongst each other, like, okay, where was the last place that they were headed? And they were like, oh, they were headed towards the Lover's Lane area. I'm not sure what the kids called it. I'm sure they had a name for it, but I'm not sure what it was. And so that's where they headed to see if they could find any trace of Patricia or Jesse. And when they got there, within very shortly about getting there, they ended up finding Jesse's 1968 Ford Cortina parked in one of the cul-de-sacs. And it looked to be seemingly abandoned. Like, it looked like Jesse had just parked it there and, like, just up and left. Like, there was no, like, scuff marks in the dirt or anything like that to suggest that there was, like, a struggle or anything. So yeah, there was no no outward signs of a struggle or anything that had happened. It looked like Jesse had just parked the car and walked away. Now, apparently back in those days, it was popular for cars to have these, like, pop-out windows that sort of, like, popped out a few inches, and they were on, like, some hinges. And Jesse's Ford Cortina had these windows. And there was one window that wasn't secured all the way in. It wasn't pushed all the way in. And so by accessing that, with the window popped out, the nursing students were able to gain access to Jesse's car. And again, they didn't find anything amiss. Jesse and Patricia's jackets were in the back seat, and later it would be found out that all fingerprints were wiped from the car inside and out. Patricia's fingerprints weren't found, Jesse's weren't found, his brother Marty's weren't found. Like, the car had been completely wiped inside and out of all prints. Now, you would think finding Jesse's car seemingly abandoned would, like, get authorities to take the disappearance more seriously, but nah, authorities just, again, dismissed the couple's disappearance as like, oh, well, we know they were getting serious, she had, like, a pre-engagement ring, and they probably just eloped. They probably just got sucked up in their romance, and they just went off and eloped without telling everybody. Which, this didn't sit well with anyone. I mean anyone who knew Patricia or Jesse, okay? All of Patricia's friends, nursing students, her family, Jesse's family and friends, they were all adamant that, like, no, this isn't them. They wouldn't elope. And if they were going to elope, they certainly wouldn't just, like, up and leave Jesse's car and not tell anyone where they were going. So it just didn't sit right with anyone at the time who actually knew them. Carolyn said that the second she found out that Patricia was missing, she immediately got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, and she just knew something wasn't right. Now, when a few more days had passed, and, you know, it had been several days, and no one had heard anything from Patricia or Jesse, finally the authorities were like, okay, they probably didn't disappear of their own volition, and so they finally started a search for Patricia and Jesse. Finally. There were multiple lakes that were dragged, lots of wooded areas that were searched, and there was just nothing, no hide nor hair of Patricia or Jesse. It was like they had just seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth. Then, approximately 2 weeks later, on February 25th, 1971, a surveyor by the name of Robert Kirby, all right, so he's surveying some land. And this land is near a wooded area. This wooded area is known as Duke's Forest today. And so Robert here, he's walking along this wooded area. And this was another undeveloped neighborhood. Apparently there was a lot of neighborhood development going on around this time. And it was another undeveloped neighborhood. And there was another, like, dirt road that was cut into a cul-de-sac, and it, like, went into this wooded area that went into Duke's Forest about 1/4 of a mile. So this cul-de-sac was pretty secluded. And as he's walking, you know, you can see, like, beer cans and cigarette butts. Like, obviously, you know, the youth of the area use it as sort of like a hangout, make-out spot, what have you. And so he's walking along this area, and he makes what I think has got to be one of the worst discoveries, especially when you're by yourself in a wooded area. Like, why does this happen in wooded areas when people are by themselves? He discovers what he thinks is a body. So he sees this big pile of leaves, all right? And he sees this leg sticking out from them. And at first he thinks what I think a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction would be is, what's a mannequin's leg doing out here? That's weird. And as he gets closer to it, he has that sickening realization that, oh my God, this isn't a mannequin, it is a human body. And so he gets closer, realizes that, like, oh my God, this is like a human leg sticking out, and he hightails it in the complete opposite direction, which, yeah, good for you, Robert. I would do the same thing. Like, he hightails it. He is so scared. And he actually runs to this nearby trailer park. There's a nearby trailer park, and he bangs on the first door he comes across, and is just, you know, freaking out, like, oh my God, like, call the cops, I found a body. And that was when Patricia and Jesse's bodies were discovered. So the Orange County Sheriff's Office, they were the first authorities to respond, and they were horrified to discover Jesse and Patricia. They had been covered in a huge pile of leaves. The couple were tied to an oak tree that was about 10 inches in diameter, and their cause of death was later determined to be strangulation. So, Jesse and Patricia were tied up against this oak tree, right? With their backs against the bark. Oak tree's about 10 inches in diameter. They had a rope around their wrists, and their wrists were tied behind their back in very thick knots of rope. They also had a rope tied around their necks, each of their necks. And then they also had a rope that was tied around their waists that tied them to the tree. So according to the coroner, Patricia and Jesse were strangled over a period of time. They were strangled with the rope that was against their necks. They were strangled and then let go, strangled and then let go, over and over and over until they finally didn't regain consciousness. Ugh, isn't that an awful way to go? Like, what a terrible, awful way to go. Like, strangulation is such an awful way to go already, but can you imagine being, like, strangled and then revived, strangled and then revived, like, over and over until, like, you just can't take it anymore? Like, oh, how terrible. There were, now, for being out in the elements for as long as they were out in the elements for about 2 weeks, like 13, 14 days or so. Patricia and Jesse were in relatively good condition, especially for being, like, covered in leaves. Like, their clothes were relatively clean, but they had a lot of mud and dirt caked on their shoes, and more than what you would get from just walking into this area. And that's when investigators also noticed a bunch of, like, deep thrash marks in the mud near their feet. And so it is theorized that, yeah, when they were being strangled, when someone's strangling you, especially from, like, an angle, your knee-jerk reaction, it seems counterintuitive, but your knee-jerk reaction is to go with the direction of the strangulation to try to, like, get some relief. And so with their hands tied behind them and then tied to that oak tree, it is theorized that, like, that's why there's all those thrash marks near their feet, as they were kicking the ground, trying to get any type of relief from being strangled. Ugh, that's just so awful. So awful. It is said that the couple had been dead for approximately 2 weeks, so they had been dead for as long as they had been missing, leading investigators to believe they were killed the night they went missing. They died within minutes of each other, and though neither of them had been sexually assaulted, they both had been superficially stabbed in the chest with what is theorized to be like an ice pick or a Phillips screwdriver of some kind. And it is theorized that the reason these wounds exist isn't really to kill or hurt. It was to check to make sure that Patricia and Jesse were actually dead. It is thought it was like a quick jab, jab, jab to make sure that, like, their bodies didn't elicit any reaction. You know, it was the killer or killers making sure that they were indeed dead. And Patricia did have an internal injury. She had a 1/2-inch tear in her liver from a possible kick or punch to the stomach. Now, at first, there were questions as to like, okay, how many people did this? How could they get Jesse, who's a 5'10" athletic guy who knew how to take care of himself? How could someone like get the jump on him and Patricia? And I'm wondering if maybe they hurt Patricia to get Jesse to comply with their demands, you know? It would explain why she has an internal injury, just one internal injury, and he doesn't. So, I don't know, that was just my thought process on it. Now, Patricia and Jesse's funerals were held on the same day, with Jesse's being in Pittsburgh and Patricia's occurring a few hours later in Sanford. David Spivey, remember Jesse's best friend and Carolyn's now husband, he actually attended both funerals. He was a pallbearer at Jesse's funeral, and then he drove to Sanford and attended Patricia's funeral in order to support Carolyn. Now, as with most unsolved cases, particularly unsolved cases from like, you know, back in like the 70s, this time era, you're not going to be shocked to learn that one of the reasons this case remains cold and unsolved is it was completely bungled from the get-go. I know, shocker, shocker. It was completely bungled. So yeah, investigation was completely bungled from the beginning. So the murder site, the crime scene, just so happened to be right on the border of Durham and Orange counties, all right? So automatically there's questions about jurisdiction, whose case is it, you know, already not off to a great start. If that wasn't bad enough, the crime scene hadn't been secured by anyone. So the Orange County Sheriff's Office were the first to respond, but there were numerous other law enforcement agencies that also responded to the crime scene, and none of them had secured it. So immediately any forensics that could have been collected in the area, immediately contaminated. Any footprints in the area, completely contaminated and ruined. And not only were numerous investigators from different departments, like walking in and around the crime scene, like, you know, like it was any other day, reporters and even looky-loos were also able to just walk around the crime scene because it hadn't been properly secured. So yeah, already not off to a great start. Not off to a great start. So, like I said, there was questions about jurisdictions and whatnot, and whose case it would be and who would investigate it. And so, separate investigations were done by the Durham County Sheriff's Office and the Orange County Sheriff's Office. So they each started their own independent investigation. Oh, but that's not all. That's not all. The Durham Police Department decided to start their own murder investigation. The State Bureau of Investigation, known as the SBI, they started their own murder investigation on Patricia and Jesse's death. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, they did their own case as well. And if that wasn't enough, the State Department of License and Theft began their own investigation. This particular department would end up being rolled into the North Carolina DMV. But yeah, so we have 6 different law enforcement agencies doing their own investigation on the murder of Patricia and Jesse. And none of these departments communicated with each other. Yeah. None of them communicated with each other. Now, from what I could gather, from what I heard and read about the case, it came down, this is just what I came away with, this was my impression of why no communication was done, was that it was very much, you know, like, oh, well, you know, they're from that county and they don't share information, so we're not going to share information. Oh, they're the feds. Oh, they're from the state. And so it was very much this whole, like, you know, good old boy, you're not from my tribe, you're not from my neck of the woods, so I don't trust you. And so nobody shared information with anybody. Yeah, real great, right? Like, I'm sorry, But there's a reason why law enforcement is supposed to have such a, like, a revered, you know, reputation in our society. Is like, you're supposed to be protecting people. You're supposed to be solving murders. Like, 2 human lives, young human lives, Patricia and Jesse were only 19 and 20, are brutally taken, and y'all are worried about, like, you know, your jurisdiction and your egos and whatnot. Like, no, I'm sorry. Put that stuff at the door and solve the damn murder. That's my, you know, that's my 2 cents on the matter. But yeah, so these good old boy detectives, each working their own case, and no communication at all. And it finally got to a point where none of these departments even talk to the press anymore, because they would communicate to the press, but it got to a point where even they stopped communicating with the press. And so the public information on Patricia and Jesse's murder is not a whole lot. It's very slim. Now, as each department worked the case, they of course came up with suspects. Now, the overwhelming majority of these suspects were just not very good candidates at all. It almost seemed like they were just opening up a phone book and just throwing darts into it and be like, all right, that sounds good. But they eventually got to a handful of, like, viable suspects, you know, at least suspects that were like, okay, I could buy that person being a person of interest. Now, it's just not a day without cat hair in my makeup. Now, some of these suspects were cleared via polygraph tests, while others were not. Now, some of these persons of interest or viable suspects that came up in the case, some of them were local. So there was a local man. He actually lived in the trailer park that Robert had run to when he found Patricia and Jesse's bodies. He lived in that trailer park. And he was a man who had problems with peeping. He was a peeping Tom. And he also had a history of mental health issues. And he was brought up as a person of interest in the case because he worked as a gravedigger at a local funeral home. And he had just so happened to buy some rope at a local handy store that looked very similar to the rope used on Patricia and Jesse. Another coincidence was this man then quit his job as a gravedigger the day after Patricia and Jesse went missing. Another person of interest was a local criminal. Now, he was already being questioned for another murder that had taken place in the area. This murder was where a man was strapped to a tree and killed. So you can see why they would want to talk to this guy. Now, this guy was also a suspect in yet another murder. So apparently he had boasted at a bar and to his friends that, like, not only was he a suspect in 2 murders, soon he'd be a suspect in 4. And so some were wondering, okay, who are those other 2 then? Could it be Patricia and Jesse? Now, I'm going to tell you about another suspect that came onto the radar fairly early on. Let me go ahead and slap on my eyelash, and I will tell you about yet another person of interest. Okay, so another suspect / person of interest. Again, this guy came up pretty early on in the investigation, and he has never been publicly named or identified. But he was a doctor who worked at Watts Hospital, and yes, he had worked with Patricia. Now, back in the day, in the original investigation, investigators had asked him to take a polygraph test to rule him out. And at first, he was, you know, very agreeable, like, oh yeah, totally, like, I'll totally do that. And then his lawyer later called investigators and was like, yeah, no, he won't be doing that. And so, yeah, he has remained a person of suspect in the case, and he actually remains a person of suspect, a person of interest, person of suspect, what the hell? Person of interest to this day. Another weird thing about this whole case is the night that Jesse and Patricia went missing, before anyone was aware that they were missing, a man called Watts Hospital, okay? And he claimed to be Jesse's father. And he wanted to know if Jesse was a patient at Watts. Yeah, very weird. Now, investigators, they believe that this man on the other end was of course not Jesse's father, who denied calling that night. They believe it was the killer. Yeah, really weird. Now, as the case progressed and leads were drying up and it was going another day, another week without any arrests or anything, there was a potential break in the case when a serial killer by the name of William Jr. Pierce was caught. Now, he was a serial killer who had operated in Georgia and North and South Carolina. He had finally been apprehended in Georgia. And some had wondered if he wasn't the killer of Patricia and Jesse. Now, for some reason, there was debate among the different departments and among different law enforcement officials. And apparently, they had ruled out that Pierce was in the area around Patricia and Jesse's deaths. I think he had already been caught. But there were still some officials who were still trying to make the case that, no, it was this guy. Leading some to believe that, like, yeah, they were just desperate to pin this crime on anyone. So as the case went on, the Durham Police Department, they decided to consult the help of a criminal psychologist. And they specifically wanted this one specific criminal psychologist. He had gained a little bit of fame because he had helped consult other high-profile cases, such as the Boston Strangler killings in 1964. This psychologist was Dr. James A. Brussels of New York City. Or excuse me, it was a Dr. James A. Brussel, not Brussels. I think that's a town. James A. Brussel. And so the Durham Police Department decided to consult with him. They gave him the files and was like, hey, can you do a profile on the killer or killers of Patricia and Jesse? We're out of leads and we're desperate. And so he agreed. Now, Dr. Brussel, he also pushed back against this narrative that serial killer William Jr. Pierce had murdered Patricia and Jesse. He was like, nah, not at all. The crimes were too different, and Patricia and Jesse, they were killed by a lone killer. Remember how I said that there was debate on whether it was killer or killers because Jesse was such like a tall, athletic guy? So Dr. Brussel said that the killer was one man. And he profiled this murderer as a paranoid man, all right? He was, quote, out to cleanse the world, all right? So this guy would be a loner. He would be a neat, precise, athletic young man between the ages of 25 and 40. He would have anywhere from an average to above average education. Dr. Brussel theorized that he may have been rejected as a child by his mother. And worse yet, he profiled Patricia and Jesse's killer as someone who not only thought of themselves above other people, but able to judge them. I know, right? Like, isn't it enough that, you're some twat who thinks you're above other people and now you think that you're, worthy or capable of judging other people? Like, ugh, the worst. Dr. Brussel said that this man would have an excellent work record, no criminal record, and he would have a bland appearance so as never ever to stand out. Like, this would be this guy's goal, is to not stand out in a crowd. Dr. Brussel also agreed with investigators that believed the caller at Watts Hospital that night, claiming to be Jesse's father, was in fact the killer, and Dr. Brussel concurred. He said, yes, I believe it was the killer. I believe he did it to, quote, show off, to sort of, show how much more smart and capable he was compared to law enforcement. But despite all this, despite 6 different murder investigations, despite this profile by Dr. Brussel, the case went cold. And the town of Sanford, along with the Mann and McBain families, they had even gathered a $500 reward when the murders had first happened. That $500 was equivalent to about $3,400 today. And still, no leads, no nothing, and the case just became cold. And like I said, it remains unsolved to this day. Now, in 2010, 2011, right, there was this detective with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, and this detective was named Detective Timothy Horn, and he was in an old office, all right? It was this old office that wasn't used anymore, and it was going to be renovated, so he was sent there to just sort of scope out the office, see what they could use it for, and he stumbled across this old discarded box of evidence labeled Mann McBane murders, and so he took it with him to the desk and went through it. Now, as the years have gone by, we're about 2010, 2011, so we're about 40 years, all right, since Patricia and Jesse's deaths. 40 years. The Mann and McBane families, they had not given up hope of solving, and it was Carolyn who actually called the station that night, wanting to know an update on her cousin's case. She had been calling for decades at this point, wanting some update, and she got a hold of some detective who had no idea what she was talking about, had no idea who Patricia or Jesse were, who Carolyn was, and it just so happened that Detective Horn was working that night, and he overheard this detective having this conversation with Carolyn, and he was like, yo, I know what that is. I just found this box of evidence. Hand it over here. And that is how Carolyn met Detective Horn. And the two struck up a friendship, and they decided to pursue Patricia and Jesse's case. They ended up becoming very close and trying to work this case. And in fact, they actually petitioned the local sheriff to officially reopen Patricia and Jesse's murder. And the sheriff allowed them to, and Detective Horn got to lead the charge. He was the lead investigator on the case. Now, Horn has said that what makes cold cases so difficult is that it's, quote, hard to develop new information. You have to rely on the photographs and the files and the evidence of that time period and how it was collected and how it was stored. And, you know, yeah, that's what makes any cold case super hard. You have to rely that the detectives that came before you did their job and properly documented everything. Which, of course, that's not what happened here. So, this box of evidence that Detective Horn had stumbled across was in terrible shape, all right? A bunch of the files had just been thrown in there. They were mixed together. Rubber bands had rotted away, like letting all files like just get loose. And so, like, yeah, there were reports that would like jump from page 2 to 4 to 6. There were other reports that would have, like, you know, pages 1, 2, 3, 4, and then missing page 5 and 6. Like, it was a mess. And Detective Horn had to spend a lot of time just building the box of evidence to a cohesive unit that he and his partner, Detective Don Hunter, could actually work the case. And so, after painstakingly organizing the evidence and going over it, Detectives Horn and Hunter, they had finally come up with their own suspects, a primary suspect and a secondary suspect. So yeah, after spending painstaking hours going over this evidence, coming at the case with fresh eyes, Detectives Horn and Hunter came up with their primary and secondary suspect, and guess what? A lot of the original investigators, they were still alive, and so the detectives, Horn and Hunter, they gathered as many of the living investigators as they could to put on a presentation of sorts, to show the original investigators, like, this is the information we've gleaned, this is what we have come up with, what do y'all think? And after their presentation, Horn said that the room was completely, quote, silent. That all, if not most of, if not all of the information, I can talk, I promise. All of, if not most of the information that Detectives Horn and Hunter had presented to the original investigators had been completely new to all of those original detectives on the case. Had been completely new. And why? Because no one communicated with each other back then. And Detective Horn has said that he believes if the departments had just communicated with each other, if they had just talked about what evidence they had, what information they had collected, he really does believe that this case could have been solved. And yeah, it probably could have been. So yeah, Detectives Horn and Hunter continued to work the case, and in 2018, so nearly 50 50 years, all right? Nearly 50 years after Patricia and Jesse's deaths, there was a potential new break in the case, all right? Technology offered a potential break, all right? So there was this new piece of technology that had been created, all right? It's called an MVAC. Now, an MVAC is like a wet vacuum DNA collection system, and it collects DNA from very hard to reach or hard to get out places, such as, oh, I don't know, the tight knots used to bind Patricia and Jesse. Yeah, so this MVAC, it was actually designed to determine and identify pathogens in food samples, but had been turned into this DNA collection system. So it's similar to like a handheld vacuum cleaner. It sprays out this like liquid fluid solution. That solution is then captured and condensed onto a filter, and the DNA samples are then taken and extracted from that filter and identified. And though there were a lot of missteps in this case, one of the good things that happened during the investigation was that the ropes used to bind Patricia and Jesse, they were in pristine condition. They had been kept in very, very good condition, and they were all ready for the MVAC to collect on. So awesome, right? Fantastic. We potentially have a break in the case. Unfortunately, the MVAC was able to get some DNA evidence from the rope, but not enough to actually make not enough to actually identify the sample. There just wasn't enough DNA there to identify it as anything. And so, yeah, the case went cold once again. And yeah, that's sort of the end of it. The case was made a subject of an 8-episode podcast called The Long Dance. Now, I listened to this podcast. It is a really well done podcast. It is done by writer and filmmaker Eric Pruitt, and investigative journalist Andrew Adamak, and producer Piper Kessler. Now, Detective Horn actually opened up his original case files to the podcasters, and the podcasters, Eric and Andrew, I was unclear if Piper did part of the research. All of the articles I read just talked about Eric and Andrew's research over years, so yeah. Detective Horn opened up all of his original case files to them. They went over it. They interviewed locals. They interviewed like a local reporter who kind of gave them sort of like an inside view as to like what the relations between the different law enforcement officials and the press and all the time. It was really, really interesting. And through their years of research and going over Horn's case files, interviewing locals, they even interviewed some members of Patricia and Jesse's families. Carolyn did an interview for the podcast. They came up with their own set of suspects, all right? And one of those suspects, they just happen to be one of the same suspects that Detectives Horn and Hunter came up with. Yeah, it is none other than that unnamed doctor that worked at Watts Hospital. Now, when Horn and Hunter had presented their primary and secondary suspect, one of the suspects was passed away, and the other suspect was living. That's this doctor that worked at Watts Hospital. He is over 80 years old now. And Horn and Hunter, Detectives Horn and Hunter, they actually did interview him. And Detective Horn was telling Eric and Andrew on the podcast about his experience with this doctor, all right? And it was pretty much the same experience that the original investigators had, where he talked about, like, yeah, at first he was, you know, very open, very welcoming. Oh, yeah, I'll help any way that I can. Yeah, bro, you need like a DNA test? Yeah, I'll be happy to. And Detective Horn said that when they left his house, they didn't even get to the end of the block before that doctor's lawyer called Detective Horn and was like, yeah, no, that ain't gonna happen. He ain't taking a polygraph. He's not giving you a DNA sample. He's done. You're done. You're not gonna talk to him anymore. And this is exactly what that doctor did back in the day. Now, there were other things that made it kind of like made this guy kind of suspicious, and he's kind of my favorite suspect in this cold case. But I don't want to use the fact that he lawyered up immediately as like something against him, because I got to tell you, like, if cops talk to me about anything, even if I'm a witness, yeah, I'm going to lawyer up. Like, I'm sorry, I watch the news. But there were other things that really made this guy suspicious. And Andrew and Eric actually got an interview with this doctor for their podcast where they actually name him. And that's why I don't want to name him on my video, because I don't want to overshadow their years of hard work. Like I said, they presented a lot of information that is just nearly impossible to get. That's where I got a lot of the background information on Patricia and Jesse and who they were and their family dynamics and whatnot. So I highly, highly recommend listening to the Long Dance podcast. It's only 8 episodes, and like I said, it's really well done. And yeah, so they got an interview with this doctor, right? He actually interviewed for the podcast. They name him and everything. And their recorded experience with this doctor is almost exactly what Detective Horn described, where at first he seems really open and nice, like, oh, hey, yeah, we're podcasters, we're looking at this case, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as the questions get a little uncomfortable, get a little tense, like, his demeanor changes like that, and it's really creepy. So I don't know, it's really interesting. On the podcast, they present 2 other suspects. They present a grand total of 3 suspects, and Detective Horn had instructed them to present each suspect like independently, like with no bias or anything, and I think they did a really good job. Like I said, the unnamed doctor who worked at Watts is my favorite suspect that they presented in the podcast. They also did some interesting tie-ins with 2 of these suspects. It was really interesting. Like I said, really recommend listening to it. And then come back here and tell me, who do you think, out of the 3 suspects that they have, who do you think did it? Was it the doctor? Is it one of the other ones they presented? I am dying to know what you think. And yeah, with that, that is the Unsolved Valentine's Day Murders of Patricia Mann and Jesse McBain. And I'm sorry I kind of ran out of makeup towards the end there. I did my makeup much faster than I thought. I thought I was gonna run out of story before I ran out of makeup, but it seemed to be the other way around, so sorry about that. I hope you don't mind. I did black lipstick again. I know I did that last week with Bianca, but I just really love black lipstick. I feel like it doesn't get the love that it deserves. I like dark lipstick in general. Like, I have no lips, so I love dark lipstick because it makes me feel like I have lips. So yeah, anyway, I will go ahead and end this week's case. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a wonderful week. Take care of yourself out there. Remember, don't be a dick. I don't say that just to parrot Will Wheaton. It's just really good advice. Like, things are tough right now, man. Like, things are so tough. Don't be a douche. Don't be a dick. When you go out in public, just be decent, all right? It doesn't cost anything, and just being decent to someone could just make their entire day. So that's why I say don't be a dick. Alrighty, I will see you next Tuesday. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.